The Holy Gospel according to John. Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." When Jesus realized they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land toward which they were going. This is the gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord.
Well, good morning. Today we have a text that involves miracles, or in John's gospel he calls them signs, and I want to start with a couple of notes. First, in verse 15, it talks about the fact that after the great crowds gather around him, he senses that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, and he withdrew by a mountain to himself. This is, of course, because he has not come into the world to be king, and they are misinterpreting the sign that he gave as a possibility that as a king he would be able to feed them constantly and give them all kinds of material success. And so, of course, he rejects this and goes up to the mountain by himself. The second thing is just a correction in interpretation. It says they wanted to take him into the boat. The actual text could read more properly, "They willingly received him into the boat." I don't know why the translator did it the way he or she did it, but it means that they willingly received him. They saw him, willingly received him. And the fact that they were afraid, or it uses terrified, probably afraid would be better, I believe has to do with the storm and not to the appearance of Jesus. In other words, there's a clause there that's in a particular place, but I would say it means the sea became rough, a strong wind was blowing, and they were afraid, or they were terrified of that. You can interpret it any way you want to, but that's the way I would suggest that we look at that particular text. Now, in a text like this, when we have a text in the Bible that has to do with this, we have some choices as to how to read it, how to understand it. And those choices, essentially, as I'm going to break them down, are 3. We can take it literally. We can take it metaphorically, which means it stands for something else, it kind of symbolism. Or we can take it spiritually. And I would remind you again what I've said many times: the Bible is a spiritual book. It's not a history book. It's not a cookbook. It's not an engineering manual. It is a spiritual book. It was written for us to uplift us, to inspire us, and to change us. And that's its purpose and its function, and it is all on a spiritual level, never on a physical or worldly level, or even metaphorical level. So on a literal level, some people would say, this taken literally means that Jesus literally fed 5,000 people with just a few loaves and a couple of fish, and that he literally walked on water, and that he literally moved this boat to safety by some magical power that he had. In a couple of the Gospels, he tells the wind, "Be still," and the wind is still, but the end result is the same. The disciples are in one case in the middle of a storm, and next they're in safe harbor. I know that I'll probably be considered to be somewhat of a heretic, but I have never from the beginning taken these things literally. It's a spiritual book, and it's designed to communicate with us on a spiritual level. Likewise, I don't take it metaphorically. I don't think that it means the feeding of the 5,000 means, for example, as it has been interpreted, that God has given us a world of abundance where there's enough food to feed everybody. We may not distribute it properly, so some people might not get the food that they need, but God has provided us with an abundant world. So the feeding of the 5,000 is to communicate to us the abundance of God's creation. Well, the problem with that is, first of all, that in a few years, 20 to 30 years, is no longer going to be true. Right now, perhaps there are enough resources in the world to feed the number of people that we have. But by the middle of this century, the population of the world will be in excess of that which the world can support with its resources as currently consumed. And so the business of God providing for all because of creation, I would question very sincerely. But before even that, the world is unevenly created so that there are vast stretches which are arid and cannot grow any food. And there are places where water is scarce, and water will run out before food does. And the metaphorical interpretation of the walking on water is metaphorically that God comes to us wherever we're at, that God moves to us, and that whatever obstacle is in the way, such as a sea or an ocean, that God is able to overcome that and come to us in our time of distress or in our time of the storm. And again, I would say my experience as a pastor has been that doesn't always occur. I've had many people come to me over my career as a pastor who were distraught, who were experiencing the storms of life. Not talking about spiritually, I'm talking about the storms of life, disease, death in the family, separation, that kind of thing. And in no way would I claim that God has come to them, that is, in any way that they could discern or that they could understand. And so they are left in despair, not understanding why God would not be present with them in that time of trouble. And I know that some would interpret this as simply that they're not open to God's presence. I'm not so sure. And then finally, that God will always keep us safe in safe harbor, and obviously that is not true. We are not always kept safe in this world. Tragedy happens, things happen to human beings, and therefore safety, at least in the metaphorical sense, in the sense of the world, is not something that I would preach to very many congregants or to very many assemblies. However, on a spiritual level, the text is absolutely clear and absolutely true on the spiritual level. Spiritual sustenance, that is being fed by the bread of life, as it says in the Bible, as John says, is constant and overabundant. We are never starving for or in need of spiritual sustenance. God's very presence in the world in the person of Jesus Christ, as John calls him, the bread of life, I give you the bread of life, is constant and always there. We will never starve spiritually. God will always provide. And as far as God coming to us, God constantly comes through the spiritual obstacles that are in our lives, comes into our lives spiritually and fills them, crosses whatever water needs to be crossed in whatever manner it needs to be crossed spiritually, and comes into our lives to enlighten us, lift us up, and provide us with hope. And we may not be kept safe from material storms, metaphorical or otherwise, but we are always kept safe spiritually. God brings us into safe harbor spiritually always, and we are surrounded by God's spiritual comfort and spiritual protection in every sense. So, the text is right on target as far as the spirituality and how we live the life of the Spirit. And we are called to live a life of the Spirit. We are called to understand that we are beings that are not simply physical, material, but we Spirit has been instilled within us by God, and it is the Spirit of God. We are made in God's image. And I don't believe that means God looks like me. I believe we're made in God's image because our spirit is in the image of God. It is in fact God's own Spirit which inhabits us, I believe. Now, this is not simply a case of someday after we die, we're going to understand that we'll have the life of the Spirit, whenever or whatever that might be in the future. And even Paul said he wasn't clear as exactly what was going to happen after we died. This is for now. This is for this life. The spiritual life is ours, present text, right now as we live. And it is that way because we are called to live life spiritually, and a life lived spiritually is a life lived fully. Remember, Jesus talked about abundant life. I've come that you might have life, you might have abundant life and have it abundantly. The only way for a human being, for you or I, to live life as it is meant to be lived abundantly is to live it with a spiritual vision, to understand that everything that surrounds us is transitory, and the only thing that is solid and true is the life of the Spirit. Life lived fully is abundant life, and that's what God calls us to do. No matter what the storms, no matter what the situation, we are uplifted and enlightened by God's own Spirit. Amen.